Señoras y señores, buenos días y bienvenidos a esta jornada de difusión tecnológica. Quisiera agradecerles su presencia y su respuesta a esta convocatoria, así como a todos los expertos que tenemos hoy en la mesa. La jornada de diseño de estructuras organizativas flexibles basado en la teoría de la complejidad tiene como objeto hacer una difusión del lenguaje propio de la complejidad y redes y exponer unos casos de aplicación. Ese es el objetivo de la jornada de hoy.
This is an absolute pleasure for me because, as you may or may not know, I'm the coordinator for links with industry and government for Existence. And my job has been, over the past year, to organize various seminars to try and disseminate some of the ideas that arise from the network of excellence. And although it's supposed to be a European network of excellence, most of the seminars last year were in fact based in London. And so I'm truly delighted that we are now outside London. Just to give you a little bit of background, Existence is a European network of excellence, and what that means is that a group of institutions and individuals around Europe work together to exchange their latest work, their ideas, so that we can all learn from each other as to how this thing of complexity science can actually benefit us all, and how can we look across the different domains, across the different disciplines. So physicists talk to biologists, to chemists and so on, and also to social scientists, although we tend to be in the minority. But there is this wonderful cross-fertilization.
A recognized international expert in the research field of complexity and networks. Please, Ricard Solé, when you want. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the organizers to invite me to such a nice city. Probably the best person to give this introductory talk should be someone who is an expert on social networks. That's not my case. My students make jokes all the time saying that since I don't like people, I don't like social networks, which is not completely true. So I'll try to give an overview of a number of pretty recent results that emerge from complexity theory, in particular from the analysis of complex networks and how they fit into our view of how evolution takes place, both at the level of biological systems but also the level of artificial systems. So let me start with a tale. Everybody is familiar, at least in principle, with the internet. So we think that the internet is something like the newest thing in technology and the newest thing in technological innovation. Actually, it's interesting to see that historically there's a first event that happened to occur at the end of the 19th century, which is pretty much the same thing, which was the telegraph network. Actually, if you look at this picture and you see the cables here, these remind us that networks have been around for a very long time. And as explained in this book, which is an extraordinarily fascinating book, The Victorian Internet, when the telegraph network emerged, a completely new community of people emerged too, and a completely new type of social interaction emerged. And it's very nice to see that what he called the Victorian Internet, the telegraph network, is not different from Internet in many, many ways. And actually, if you read the book, you will see that the story tells us that things like communities of people making chats and hackers and all that kind of stuff, including the perspective, the hopes that generated, like the telegraph network will make the world much better and we will communicate as never we did, and so on, is exactly the same as happened with the internet. At some point, the telegraph network vanished because something new emerged, the telephone network, and much later in time, the internet. And it's nice to see that this is exactly what happened in evolution. New species emerge at some point because of innovations emerge in time, and at some point something completely vanishes. A large extinction takes place. But extinction always leaves space for the previous innovations to survive. So in some way, the telegraph network is still around. But the most interesting thing is that the internet reinvented a lot of things.
I make a small introduction to it, and the next. Milton Kelly is the director of the Complexity Research Program in the London School of Economics and at the Open University. She's a coordinator of links with industry and government for the European Network of Excellence called Systems, as she has explained before. This network started on April 2002. She's also a director of the Complexity Society, a UK-based network of networks of complex systems, and advisor to several European and USA organizations on the implications of the theories of complexity for organizations, and specifically on the strategy, Ita Legacy Systems, organizational learning, and the emergence of organizational forms.
What we are concerned about is the social world. We work very closely with organizations, and I would like to tell you about one such company, which is Rolls-Royce Marine. So that will be, after I quickly go through the kinds of tools and methods that we use, I will then show you how we use them with Rolls-Royce Marine and what effect that had. The final part of the presentation, the third one, will be to talk a little bit more about complexity, to use the theory to explain some of the processes, some of the events that happened. So hence the tripartite presentation. What our methodology does is we work very much collaboratively with our partners, and we use what we call a collaborative action research approach. In other words, we don't just observe organizations, we actually work with them. We work with them to not only introduce complexity so that they can start understanding the principles and the concepts, but the final outcome is to actually help them to create what we call an enabling environment. And the process of getting to that point, how do you actually identify the social, the cultural, the technical, and very often also the economic and political conditions that will help you create that environment. And we always talk in terms of co-creation, because we never impose anything on our partners. We work with them very, very closely. And what I will show you is a mixture of both qualitative and quantitative tools and methods. And as I said, the emphasis is very much on co-creation.
Damos la bienvenida a Peter. I make a small introduction of himself. Peter Fryer was chief executive of the Amberside TEC. These training and enterprise councils were created throughout the UK in 1991 by the then government out of the privatization of the Manpower Services Commission, where he based the management, leadership and organizational principles of the TEC on the application of complexity. Nowadays, he's an independent consultant and co-founder of Toha Mines. I don't know if the name is all right. Peter, please.
Good morning and, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me here to tell my story, because that's what it is in a sense. So what I want to tell you is a few stories about our journey in the Humberside Training Enterprise Council along the journey of complexity. Now, a note of caution as I tell this story, because however I tell it, it sounds like we knew what we were doing. It sounds like we had a plan and we did things systematically and we knew what was happening. We didn't. We kept stumbling into things. We kept finding things through complexity theory, and we behaved like children with a new toy in our toy box. We played with this toy as much as we could, and in playing with this toy, we found new things and developed new things. So it was a fairly chaotic journey, full of blind alleys, full of wonderful surprises, but it wasn't a planned, structured approach. So we didn't sit down and say, here's complexity theory, what do we have to do in order to run the organisation on these principles, and then got on with it. It wasn't like that at all. Because in reality, complexity found us.
I think that's it in a nutshell. One of the things that I find in all the work that I do with complexity, both at the Training Enterprise Council and since, is about helping people see the world differently. Because once you see complexity, it automatically redefines those terms. You don't have to do it for people. It may take a few days, a few weeks for them to sort of begin to let it sink in, the implications sink in, but the more you explore the implication, it automatically redefines those terms. And on the question of power, I think somebody asked a question about power earlier as well. I have a view as power is one of those, again, is a paradoxical thing, that the more power you give away, the more you get. I had no budgets when I was chief executive. I had no control of any budgets. I had no control of any staff. I didn't have the authority to tell anybody what to do. I didn't have the authority to spend any money. And yet I was probably the most powerful chief executive of all the training enterprise councils, because I had a team of people who were making those decisions far better than I was, doing things which I couldn't possibly even begin to imagine that could be done. And therefore, whether I was there or not, it didn't really matter. The whole organisation was humming, things were happening, we were achieving things, and I could go places and talk about things, and I knew that the weight of the organisation was always with me, supporting me, as did everybody else. So power became something, it grew exponentially within the organisation. It was something we all had.
I as a person, a non-business person, I guess, what I can say is that if you have learned something about complex systems over the last decade, that in spite of the criticisms that arise when it was proposed, that still remains as a powerful principle, is that any kind of organization that you build up, or any kind of complex system that really works, it's always going to be around a compromise between some amount of order that you put into the system, or is predefined by constraints, that's whatever it is, and some amount of, you can call disorder or plasticity or whatever, that allows the system to adapt. And I think that an important role to be played by theory in the future in your area is to try to figure out how to identify which are the components. Because we all the time think that complexity theory has to be used in terms of allowing the system to self-organize, to take advantage of the bottom-up properties. But I think to some extent it would be good to know, and models can help a lot about that, what sort of global features you should ask the system to have in order to get that plasticity. And so to introduce some amount of top-down control, if you want, into the system to make it optimal.
We work with a lot of organizations, not just the Rolls-Royce Marine. And one thing that we keep finding is something happens when people start understanding what complexity means. It is not managing complexity, because if you really think about it, managing complexity is a contradiction. You can never manage it. What you can do is understand what it means within an organizational context. Because once you start understanding what those concepts are and how a complex evolving system like an organization actually operates, then you start to work with those characteristics. What we often do, and a lot of the more traditional management theories have us do, is inadvertently, without meaning to, we block a lot of these characteristics. So we often constrain self-organization and emergence and co-evolution, etc., etc. And understanding what is happening, we can facilitate it, we can help it to happen. And everything that Peter was describing, I think, is the way that he created that enabling environment and allowed these characteristics to actually happen, to unfold. And I think that's very important. That is why it is a change in seeing. How do you see the world? And once that change takes place, everything else changes. So I think that's the important element.
Just add a point to that, partly to what Eve was saying and Ricard was saying. I found well, at least in our organisation, others I've worked with, chaos is almost impossible to achieve. If you create these enabling conditions, you do sometimes find that things break down, but a new order will very rapidly emerge. But what tends to happen is, because it isn't the order we're looking for, we don't see it, and therefore we say this is chaos. It's not, there is a new order there, but we're just not prepared to see it. And therefore one of the skills you need is this skill of spotting patterns and spotting new order as it emerges, and then being able to say, let's go with this new order. In all the 10 years I was there, we never once had a reorganisation. And yet the organisation was totally different at the end than it was at the beginning, and it changed several times. But the structure, if you like, had followed rather than had led. The structure just came about automatically by the whole organisation reorganising to fit the new order which had emerged from this enabling, this reordering to go on.
I'd like to suggest to the panel that we ourselves need a slight change of terminology, because we keep talking about complexity theory when it seems to me from everything you've said this morning that we're really talking about a complexity paradigm. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the history of thinking in organizations, you can go right back to the 1740s. There are really two changes that created an organizational paradigm which was essentially Newtonian in the sense that it was characterized by linearity. One was the factory system, where you stabilize a local part of the environment so that you can apply linear control processes. So you move from the putting out system, which was very complex and very varied, to something that goes on inside a single space with a single process that can be controlled. The other part of the paradigm comes from the military model, where you have the watchmaker at the top, blind or otherwise, controlling soldiers as if they were pieces of machinery. And so for that you need an authority model, for that you need hierarchy. So now you've got the two components of traditional organizational theories, which actually were taught right up until the 1980s, say in business schools. And people today deeply inhabit these models. So the issue is not, can we now add complexity theories to that model, but can we change the model? Because it's a fundamentally different model. And I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Max. I agree with you entirely, and what I would like to actually tease out a little is how these two models you've just described are themselves evolving and moving towards this complexity paradigm. One is the military model, and I think it is very interesting how the military themselves are now using the complexity paradigm in areas where the control and command model no longer operates. For example, in the Falklands, the leaders were not at the face. They were not actually involved in the battle. They were too far removed, and therefore the teams that were at the war face actually had the authority to do what needed to be done because they had the best information locally. The same is happening now when dealing with the different, gosh, the word has just escaped me. What is happening now in Iraq and so on. These local groups are thinking in a totally different way, and in order to be able to do something about it, the military have to begin to think in the same way, and therefore they need to unlearn the command and control ways of thinking that they had been brought up with, and to learn the new ways that are now being used. So even that model is already changing and actually using very much the complexity paradigm. So yes, I agree with you entirely.
I partly agree with you. On the one hand, I agree entirely that it is a new paradigm. It's a new way of viewing the world, and it would be wonderful if we could just go along and say to organisations, look, you've been viewing the world totally wrongly, your organisation, for all these years, and you're now going to do it differently. The trouble is, it doesn't work like that. This paradigm is very threatening to people who currently run organisations, because they've got to where they are by being good at what they do, the way they do it. And to accept this new idea means they have to go through a stage of incompetence, if you like, in order to gain new competencies. So they are very reluctant to adopt a lot of this, which is why I just talk about complexity being there, and I suggest to them they may as well do it as well as doing what they already do. So rather than saying to them, I want you to change, and it goes back to this big change, isn't it? If you go to an organisation and say, I want you to make a big change, they'll fight you. So what you do is you say, you keep all the things you've got, but for a day, just one day, I'd like you to look at your organisation from this perspective, and then you can go back to everything you've always done, the way you've done it tomorrow. So that's not very threatening. But I do that knowing that once they've done it once, they can't go back. But in order for them to make the first step, you have to make it sound non-threatening, and you have to start gradually and slowly and just say, look, your organisation is a complex adaptive system. Let's just look at it as one to give you a bit more information. You don't have to change anything, you just need to look at it differently. But they will then start making the changes. But it is very, very threatening for people. I mean, for me it's easy, because I'm absolutely useless at doing management the way management is taught. I can't do it. I'm just absolutely appalling at it. So all this complexity stuff's like manna for heaven for me, because it's, you know, I can do that, but I can't do the old stuff. But I'm sure if I was a really good accountant and came up that route, I'd find this very threatening. And we have to help them over that hurdle.
Yes, I would like to tell something more about the change of paradigm. One is the relationship with technology. When we think in technology, we always think usually in the factory as, and we design a system of management which is related with lack of space and lack of times. Some of the management we are used to work with is working in the assumption that you need some time for decisions, and you need some time for logistics, some time for some space between the action and the decision. And now, what we have to take into account is that technology is giving us the possibility of just-in-time decisions and also just-in-time conversations and so on. So we have the space at the time and the situation and the bus of Nonaka to interchange knowledge in the same in the course of action. So we have to talk a little bit also about technology, like an enabler for doing this kind of new organizations, which Soler has placed very well in his presentation, is talking about the icon of internet as a network. So technology is another attractor of this of new organization. The image of the new organization should be built under the icon of internet and the relationships between us, without waiting for lack of space or lack of times. We have the possibility of work together just in time. Anyone want to say something on this?
Well, it's not a trivial thing. When I talk about technology, I talk about, let's say, real technology, not the technology of management. So in that sense, it might be that big difference around. But what I do think is that in the future, if we want to take advantage on what I think it can be called complexity theory. I mean, complexity, the term paradigm, it's a very loose one. And I think that even in pieces, complexity has established a number of solid results in the past. And in particular for communities, I think that this is not a criticism. I mean, I think that the meeting is to provide some initial insight, but it would be good for the people around this area to give a look to what the theory on complex networks is saying about communities, because communities can be measured, can be well characterized, and all communities that have been analyzed clearly reveal some fundamental universal principles of organization. Some of them result from constraints, because the way that communities emerge follows laws that might be path dependent, but I think that more often are strictly limited by underlying laws. And probably we should be able in the future to take advantage of this knowledge in order to be able to, not to drive community building, because this is a very big thing, but to take advantage of very small changes that you can put into the community structure that may allow it to work pretty well. So in that sense, I think that technology provides some clues about that, and software in particular, I think it's a very good example, because big software programs are built up by communities of people which work in parallel, and it's really kind of fun to see what's the outcome of this process, because sometimes a small community builds a very powerful, very well designed module, and then the others design another module. Everything works very well, and you put them together, and it's a complete disaster. So I think that technology provides a lot of insight into how communities emerge and what is the advantage you can take from theory, which is very solid.
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to sound like a technophobe. I mean, I fully embrace all these new technological improvements, but I'm not sure quite that it has any particular effect on complexity, because complexity existed long before we had technology and will exist long after it's all disappeared. And in fact, just as an example, one of the things we had to do in the organisation, we had to create technology-free Fridays, which meant that if you wanted to talk to somebody in the organisation, you couldn't ring them up and you couldn't use the email or any other device requiring some form of technology, because people had got too lazy. They used to just sit at the desks and ring people up or email them, and we said, no, on Friday, if you want to talk to someone, you've got to go and find them and speak to them face to face to make that contact, to maintain that contact. And technology enables things to happen, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of what is happening. It enables things to happen quicker, it enables our networks to be different, if you like, and broader, but the principles underlying all that are the same. I mean, I am at the hub of, if you like, and
slightly different perspective, and ask the question whether technology is always an enabler, or sometimes it can actually be a constraint. And I will give you an example. One of the projects we've done is looking at what are called IT legacy systems. These are systems that tend to be very large, tend to be quite old, but the key characteristic is that they do not support changes in the business strategy. So the organization wants to go in a new direction, and the existing systems are actually constraining that new direction. Now, one of the key things we found was that it wasn't just a technology issue. Part of the problem was that there was very little communication between the people involved. The information systems domain tends to attract individuals that don't actually like talking to other humans. They much prefer working with the computers. And the strategies always, very often, spent very little time trying to explain where they wanted the company to go. So you had, to put it very crudely, two areas in an organization that were evolving along separate paths with fairly limited coevolution between them. Now, that is where we found that the technology actually was constrained, and by facilitating the dialogue, the coevolution between them, was when things started to improve. And you can say, well, how can dialogue actually help to improve the technology? Well, I can actually give you an example here. This was a World Bank and its European operations. They had banks right across Europe, and they had to align all their systems in order to work with the euro when the euro was about to be introduced. Now, everything was going fine until there came a point where the common elements between the systems could not be signed off because no one actually owned them, because they were common to everyone. Now, the dialogue that had been initiated earlier, the conditions that made it possible for these people to talk to each other and create an informal network, actually then helped them to pick up the phone or talk to each other and say, look, let's agree, I will sign this module, you will sign off that module, and so on. So the social relationships actually helped the technology to go ahead by not creating a bottleneck that made, that helped and we saw an awful lot of this. That's one area. The other is, I think, to realize that there is always an interface between the technology and the human, and finally that the technology is one of the many interrelated aspects. So I think it's a very important one, but it's only one element, and we need to look at how it relates to all the others.
Thank you. For Richard. I was fascinated earlier this morning about talking about tinkering. And I was wondering whether through your research in natural sciences and biology, if ever you've had the sensation or impression that we may discover one day a master tinkerer.
You mean by master tinkerer? You mean someone who did everything but not very well? I don't know. What seems clear is that clearly in evolution, but to our surprise in technology, and I will conjecture that that's pretty much the leading mechanism. Once you reach giving complexity thresholds, unless you prevented that in some way, you end up doing tinkering. And again, software engineering, as some of you know very well, once you reach a complexity threshold, people start to try to save the project because the project is big and you invested a lot of money in any way. so that in the end you sell something that can be sold in the market, even if it has some problems, as we know from Windows, for example. So I think that tinkering is probably a leading mechanism. And actually, in one of the projects that got funded by the 6th program, our contribution will be to kind of define something that we call, I don't remember the name, evolvable tinkering. So a kind of new method that exploits that kind of mechanism that is probably the leading one. And the only way of preventing that, and I got some ideas after Peter's talk, is to really being able to allow people probably to not be being so optimal when they design their modules, to make mistakes if you want, in order to kind of explore the landscape of possibilities. So that's, I think, it's a pretty good idea.
Peter, please.
Yeah, just to add a bit to that, one of the dangers of conferences like this and the conversations we have is we can create the impression that complexity is the answer. But every generation which has made new discoveries has thought that that was the answer. I mean, complexity is just one step along the way. The real answer is somewhere totally different and something we're just not able to comprehend at the moment because we're not ready for it. In fact, we'll probably, the big answer, we will never get to it. So if there is a master tinkerer, they're so far away we'll never know.
Another word for tinkering, as you said, is bricolage. And another word that I will offer you is play. And I think we often forget how much creativity comes from play. And I'll just leave you with that thought.
Bueno, para cerrar ya, le voy a dar la última palabra a Yves, que quiere hacer la despedida, y agradeceros a todos esta jornada. Espero que haya sido positiva para todos y que hayamos aprendido mucho. Yo por lo menos sí he aprendido. If you have the last word, please. Yes, yes.
Finally, I would also like to thank all of you, because without you, we would not have had this fascinating and stimulating conversation. So thank you all very much indeed.